Good afternoon. My name is Craig Cutler, and I'm the founder of Equality Mental Health, a dedicated psychotherapy practice for the LGBTQ+ community in River Edge, New Jersey. Welcome to our third workshop series on neurodiversity and neuroinclusion. This one is called Neuroinclusion for Communities and Organizations. We have a lot to discuss and a lot to learn, and before we begin, I would like to thank the River Edge Public Library for hosting us and for all the wonderful help we received from our staff at Equality Mental Health. Today, we will dispel some of the mysteries surrounding the concept of neurodiversity. This is a term that many of us have heard before, but we may not have had much knowledge about it. Today, we are fortunate to have an excellent instructor on the topic. Kay Peterman is a graduate student of public health and social work at NYU University in New York City. They have an excellent working knowledge on the subject and also self-identify as being neurodivergent. Kay has extensive experience working with neurodivergent youth and serves as an advocate for the community. Without further ado, I turn the microphone over to Kay. Thank you.
Thank you. I have my microphone.
Perfect.
Yep.
I have a microphone here, and I'm happy to pass this around.
Yeah, so if we have questions throughout, we're using the mic just so that people on the recording can hear everyone. So welcome, everyone. As Craig said, today we're going over neuroinclusion for communities and organizations. What that is going to involve, so first we're just going to explain the meanings of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. If you've been to our previous one, this is just a review, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, because if we don't all understand. To them, we're going to go over social dynamics and different theories of those social dynamics that neurodivergent people experience and how those can be challenges, and then how we can address those. And then finally, we're just going to review other considerations like accommodations and ways to do that, different ways to do that commonly for making spaces accessible. Throughout, feel free to ask questions if you need to. Just wave to whoever has the mic and make sure you have it before you talk. And then if at any point, if it would be more comfortable for you to stand or move around or stim, feel free to do so. Just maybe move to the back so you're not distracting anyone. We are going to have a couple breaks throughout, so you don't have to worry about that. And obviously, if you need a break, you can leave. And then if you would like a copy of the presentation or hands out on your own, there's a QR code on the first slide that I'll go back to at the end, or I could go back to now if anyone needs to. Nope. Okay. So the agenda for today, so first we're just going to go over this introduction, a note on language, and then defining terms. Then we'll take a quick break. Next we'll just go over what does it mean for an environment to be inclusive and what does it mean for an environment to be accessible. Then we're going to have two sections on neurodivergent experiences and groups, just because there are a lot of different theories around that. That are pretty interesting to dig into. And then finally, we're just going to go over just making spaces accessible. And that's also going to link back to the previous workshops, because we have got into that pretty extensively. And the pre-existing slides have a lot of info for that. Any questions on this? Okay. Great, so just quick note on language. For this presentation, we will be using identity-first language rather than person-first language. So identity-first language is neurodivergent person or autistic person rather than person with autism, as this puts emphasis on these ways of being as an identity rather than as a condition or something to cure. And this is generally preferred by autistic advocates and other neurodivergent advocates, though obviously there are places where that can get more complicated, like for ADHDers, though not every individual neurodivergent person will want to use person-first language. It's just a general preference. In addition, instead of describing people as high functioning or low functioning, we're going to just say less visible support needs and more visible and high support needs. Generally, functioning labels are considered ableist. They put people in a box either as not being able to do anything or also just erasing that they have any support needs in general. So we're going to try to avoid that. The language in this area is still evolving. There are a lot of different substitutions for it. Everyone agrees the functioning labels are bad. What they use instead will vary. This is just what we're going to do in this session. And then instead of nonverbal, we'll use the term non-speaking. This comes from the non-speaking community, and it's trying to move away from this conception that just because someone doesn't talk means they have no access to words at all. A lot of them, when they use augmented or assisted communication devices, do have access to words, and many of them can write very beautifully. It's just that talking is hard. And none of these terms will be universally used by everyone in these populations. These are just general recommendations by advocates to be more inclusive. So now just defining terms. So neurodiversity. Neurodiversity just refers to the general diversity of brains in the human populace. It is a biological reality because we do all, in fact, have different brains, and that's a biological necessity. So neurodiversity itself is a concept separate from the neurodiversity movement. So that's activists and people pushing for the inclusion of neurodivergent people, and the neurodiversity paradigm, which is the framework to look at neurodiversity and neurodivergent people. And also different from being neurodivergent yourself. So you can't say someone is neurodiverse because technically speaking, any group of people is neurodiverse. So by comparison, the neurodiversity paradigm is a perspective on neurodiversity that contrasts specifically with the pathology paradigm, and is shaped by 3 principles. It believes that neurodiversity is natural and is a valuable biological aspect for the human species and for the human experience. It also believes that there is no singular normal, healthy, or correct brain. Similar to other standards, the idea that there is one right or best way for the brain to work is a social construct that is as inaccurate as the idea that there is one right or best race, ethnicity, sex, gender, or sexuality. It also it believes that the social dynamics that result from neurodiversity are similar to those that result from other forms of diversity. So consider those other groups listed, and similar forms of exclusion or reactions to a minority group will come up. At the same time, embracing neurodiversity can be a source of strength and creativity, because the more diverse people you have there, the more ideas you have, the more different experiences you can have in the group. So then separate from this, you have being neurodivergent or just experiencing neurodivergence. Neurodivergence is a broad umbrella referring to any brain that is different from what is considered typical or normal. So this can include innate forms of neurodivergence, so that's versions you're born with, so that would be things like being autistic, having epilepsy, being an ADHD, or being predisposed to anxiety or OCD, because those are all how your brain is wired when you're born. Then there are acquired versions of forms of neurodivergence. So this can include PTSD, being a habitual drug user for a very long time to the point it changes your brain, experiencing a TBI that affects your cognitive processing, or even just being a monk who meditates for 20 years and that changes your brain. So it very, very broad umbrella. And an individual can be neurodivergent in multiple ways, both innate and acquired. So for example, I'm an autistic ADHDer, and I also have migraines that I got as the result of a traumatic brain injury. So both innate and acquired. So the relationship between like neurodiversity and neurodivergence is that like the total population is neurodiverse, and you'll have neurotypical people in it, and then you also have neurodivergent people in it. And then where the conversation usually tends to focus is on the group of people within the neurodivergent community who are also disabled. Because you'll notice in that umbrella, not everyone in there is like pathologized. Like the monk who meditates for 20 years is not going to be pathologized. The habitual drug user, the drug use is going to be pathologized, but the brain might not be as much. Or it's not considered that the brain is wrong, it's just the action is. So in terms of the disability part, that's where we get into the moving away from the pathology paradigm. So disability is broadly any condition that significantly affects one's ability to do tasks related to everyday functioning. And there are a lot of overlaps between disability and neurodivergent identities. Just depending on what kind of neurodivergence you experience. And considering these overlaps, it is important to consider the two more visible frameworks for approaching disability. Let me get it. Okay, so there's the medical model. The medical model considers disability as something to be cured or fixed. It is generally the lens used most broadly. So according to the medical model, a person in a wheelchair is disabled by whatever condition put them in a wheelchair. By contrast, the social model looks at disability as something caused by the environment and the social systems that prevent a person from being there. So it sees a person in a wheelchair and it sees them as disabled by buildings that don't have ramps or elevators. And the medical model and social model are often talked as a binary, but they aren't that. It is a spectrum, and it's going to vary from disability to disability. So going back to me, like, I very much view my migraines through a medical model. I want that treated and fixed. There's not really social dynamic going on there, whereas being an autistic ADHDer is more of a social model for me. But that could also be viewed differently by someone else with the same identities. So people who experience neurodivergence that has more physical effects, like migraines or epilepsy, usually view it more through that medical lens. And then people who experience forms of neurodivergence like autism and dyslexia would be more likely to view that through a social lens. And then there's also combinations like ADHD. You might view it through a social lens, but you're also getting medication for it, which is more of a medical model type of deal. How different people with the same disability or form of neurodivergence view that can be very different from person to person, and it's important not to assume it. So with that in mind, like, the neurodiversity paradigm is specifically non-pathologizing, but many forms of neurodivergence are based on getting a diagnosis. So how does that work? So the neurodiversity paradigm does generally look favorably on self-diagnosis because, you know, it's not a pathology, it's how your brain works. You live in your brain, you know how your brain works. You should be able to say what you are. Self-identifying with specific labels is okay. I will say there is a limit to that, like, don't self-identify as an epileptic. But like for things like being autistic, you can self-identify as that. At the same time, if you self-identify, it is still okay to seek an official diagnosis. That can be necessary to get specific accommodations or just to learn more specifically about where you're struggling and what your needs are and how to meet them. And because of that, the neurodiversity paradigm and the neurodiversity movement do want assessments and evaluations to be more accessible for people who need them. Okay, so just to check in, how does this paradigm and the language in it compare to how you've seen neurodiversity discussed in places?
I mean, I'm happy to comment.
Yep.
So I really love that framework of the spectrum of medical model or pathology paradigm to neurodiversity paradigm. It made me think a lot. For example, I work with some people who understand the idea of the neurodiversity paradigm and understand how damaging potentially the medical model is or pathology paradigm, but need to or choose to access treatment options that kind of sit within the medical model. And however, I mean, in terms of this specific question, you know, in discussion groups or organizations, I think it depends on the group you're in, you know, and I occupy space in thankfully in groups that are very what I would consider neurodiversity affirming, and there's a more broader understanding of this idea of the neurodiversity paradigm, and at the same time I equally kind of sit in groups that are kind of pathology paradigm or medical model, and in terms of the language used, there's, you know, a marked difference. It's very much a kind of fix the issue, fix my kid, fix myself, in the kind of pathology paradigm setting. And it's very difficult to be in. You know, and luckily there's a movement, I think, towards like the neurodiversity paradigm, but I think it's work, it's ongoing work, right? And I think people are really just kind of coming to terms with the idea of kind of deconstructing that a little, right? And kind of thinking about where that came from. And so, yeah, I think it's a massive kind of discussion point. But I sit in kind of both spaces and kind of experience, you know, literal kind of pathologizing of, you know, autism or kind of ADHD, and then vice versa, you know, very kind of accommodating spaces. And I code switch, I do, depending on kind of what spaces I'm in. And that's an interesting kind of journey. I don't know. Anyone else want to contribute?
Yeah, I was thinking about I was thinking more about acquired versus innate, and how they're not necessarily always distinct. I was wondering where something like you mentioned, PTSD could be an example of acquired. How would something like complicated grief fall into that?
I mean, that would probably still be acquired, because the idea of innate versus acquired is that you're born with the innate ones, and
Right.
yeah.
But I'm thinking, what if I had a predisposition to it, and then it took some event to set it off?
Yeah, and that is kind of where it's more complicated. Like with the innate versus acquired, like there's the predisposition for anxiety and OCD is like a list, but like also you may or may not experience something that triggers your anxiety or OCD.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is, like you, I have chronic migraines, except I seem to have had them, well, it seems to be congenital, but they showed up in my adolescence. They've caused me all sorts of problems, and it is a disabling factor in my life. I was wondering, though, could that also fall under either? Because I was thinking, if society could better accommodate people with chronic pain, as in not place such heavy demands, give people the right, access to the right medical care, give people spaces, and like, for example, I have blackout curtains on my windows because, light sensitivity and various sensory sensitivities play into that as well. I do notice a lot of similarities between the types of accommodations I would want for my chronic pain and for being autistic as well. I don't know. Would it be possible, hypothetically, that these conditions might not necessarily be disabling under the right circumstances?
I mean, yeah, that is a great question. And that kind of goes back to, like, it's definitely not a binary in terms of, like, that will probably vary from person to person with chronic pain, and, like, how much, like, blackout curtains would help versus, like, how much you need medication.
Yeah.
I will say, like, with it not being a binary, I got that from Nick Walker, if you've ever heard of them. They're linked in the slides. But like they were comparing it to, they're trans, she is trans, and she was comparing it to, like, we describe gender as a social construct, but like if it were solely a social construct, then trans people wouldn't feel so wrong performing roles. So it might be 80% a social construct and 20% biology, so rather than like a straight up binary. So similarly for people with specific disabilities, it might be like something's 20% a social construct and 80% medicine, or like any other combination of that. So like it's never going to be half and half, or like one or the other for every single thing.
Yeah. And just to finish, the reason I ask is because, yeah, mine are very much treatment resistant. So then I look to the social model.
Yeah, absolutely. And like there are definitely aspects of the social model for migraines, like stress is a big factor, and like you said, sensory stuff. it's just also it can be really hard to separate that because we've only approached it through the medical model historically.
Can I follow up with a comment around treatment options and how neurodiversity affirming our treatment options have been kind of developed and informed, and that actually, you know, when we think about treatment resistant insert X, you know, it's often because, or it can be partially because the treatment options we have are kind of very geared towards a neurotypical kind of existence within whatever's, you know, the person's struggling with. And then I also wanted to comment on the irony of folks presenting with a PTSD type situation, and the trauma is, when you kind of break it down, is kind of very linked to growing up at neurodivergent and developing as a neurodivergent in a neurotypical world, and how the irony of the acquired kind of PTSD is as a direct result of the you know, the autism, right, for example. Right?
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, and that's something where it's like you can have both, and it can also be very complicated. It's generally listed under acquired because there's also neurotypical people that get PTSD.
Sure, but I mean that specific combination.
Yes,
right?
that specific combination. Yeah, no, that
ironic,
specific combination
right?
is so hard
and
to sort through.
It's so common in folks that I, you know, see either professionally or kind of personally. That piece of trauma that's associated with kind of growing up as a neurodivergent in a neurotypical world, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a specific trauma, and it's kind of similar to like if you're growing up as a marginalized person of any identity, you're going to get PTSD pretty much. Yeah, it is. Any other comments on the question or other thoughts? Okay. So just takeaways, so like neurodiversity just encompasses the diversity of all people, while neurodivergence just describes those who differ from neurotypical norms. Neurodivergent people don't all have disabilities, but there are many forms of neurodivergence that can be considered disabilities. So because of this, an understanding of the medical and social models of disability and how they relate to neurodivergent people can be helpful. And an understanding that how the neurodiversity paradigm is non-pathologizing, but also advocates for increased access to diagnosis because the world is complicated. So we kind of did this part too. I had a break scheduled here. Do we want to do a break, or do you want to keep going? Okay. So the next part we have defining inclusion and accessibility. And I should say I wanted to include this at the start just because inclusion and accessibility can be enacted differently in different places and mean things in different places, and also it is technically Autism Acceptance Month, and that usually brings up a complicated combination because it used to be Autism Awareness Month, and then it changed because technically anti-vaxxers are aware of autism in essence, and that doesn't really seem to do us a whole lot. So what does inclusion and accessibility mean to y'all? And it could just be the broadest answer. Doesn't have to be specific to neurodivergence.
Anything.
Okay. We want to get.
I was just gonna say equity in any space. I'm thinking I'm a school social worker, and a lot of what I do on the child study team is ensuring that students have access to an equitable education that's inclusive to their needs and their strengths. Although that doesn't always play out in the most, I'm noticing that we don't use the most appropriate language while we do this, and we're still trying to put students in a box in order to classify them and kind of meet their needs legally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, dealing with laws and then also wanting to be equitable is complicated.
Very. Very.
Anyone else? What does inclusion and accessibility mean to you? Okay. First, just what does it mean to be inclusive? So inclusion means to welcome different types of people despite differences. However, efforts to create inclusive environments often fall short in a number of ways, and I was using welcome just to be equitable and inclusive, so just equally able to access and be there, and also know that you're safe there and that you can function in a way where you could thrive. Some of the more egregious ways groups and organizations can fall short of inclusion are like many places have inclusive efforts that just involve changing word choice or making statements without actually doing any actions. Some places approach accessibility just by acknowledging someone's disability, which isn't really inclusive. The place I worked before I went to grad school, they had a thing on for Autism Acceptance Month where they literally just said, yeah, you can just paint the walls a common color and that makes it better for autistic people. And it's just, no. And then for people with disabilities, like the implementation and acceptance of accommodations can be inconsistent and often treated as a burden, which is a big barrier to inclusion. And this kind of like brings us to like the autism awareness versus acceptance combination. So we kind of have like this baseline thing of awareness. We are aware of it, but like people can be aware of something and not like it. You can see that with like anti-vaxxers in terms of autism. You can also see that with the backlash to transgender people currently. Then above that you have acceptance, but like what acceptance is can be pretty broad. Acceptance can be the uncle at a party that's like, I'm fine with gay people, but not in my house. Or, oh, that poor child with autism, like I've accepted the autistic kid exists, but I'm going to look down on them and view them in a certain way without understanding. Then there's tolerating, which is just like I'll tolerate having a gay kid, I'm not going to make an effort to understand. And then actually being inclusive, which is like making an effort to learn and to actually like support someone's identity and accept them for all of who they are. That's inclusion, and then like within that we talked about accommodations, and that's all about being accessible. And like accessibility broadly refers to making it easier for those with barriers to access a place or group, so that goes back to the equity. And this is largely talked about with disabilities, but it can also apply to like cultural and socioeconomic differences. So like usually when we talk about accessibility, like we think of ramps or something else that's very physical and visible. Or an ASL interpreter, and that is a form of accessibility. There's physical accessibility, but there's also financial accessibility is a huge one, and that is definitely applicable to neurodivergent people and people with disabilities who are more likely to be low income. There's also communication and language accessibility, and this can be relevant for neurodivergent people who are non-speaking or who come from different backgrounds or who have auditory processing issues and need visuals alongside talking. So having AAC or augmented or assistive communication tools or just having multiple communication formats is really important, and also offering different languages, things in different languages if there are people in the community that speak something other than the primary language. And then also just administrative accessibility, I feel like isn't talked about a lot, but is huge for neurodivergent people in particular, just because paperwork is a huge executive functioning barrier, and there's usually no help with it. And so it gets put off, and then you get in trouble for handing it late or doing it wrong.
Can I make a comment on that? I worked with an ADHDer who could not sign the contracts, could not print them off and get them signed and return them to me. And so we did a verbal thing where I noted that they kind of verbally agreed. I read the contract out in a session and I noted the date, etc., and that they kind of verbally agreed to them, and that's how we ended up getting them done.
I had an ADHD where like after the third session I was just like, okay, so since we're in the session and you're thinking about it, want to do it now while I'm here? And they're like, yes, that will be the only way that gets done. And it's like, okay. Yeah, like it's huge. But like kind of similar to like we mainly think of ramps and ASL interpreters. For neurodivergent people, a lot of attention goes to like physical and sensory accessibility, which like is huge. Like not being overwhelmed and having a meltdown is huge, but like things beyond that, like the financial part, like the administrative part, like the communication part, are just not done, and that definitely prevents being able to access things or just being able to feel safe and included. So what are examples of like successful and less successful efforts for inclusion and accessibility that you've seen for neurodivergent people or anyone else?
I can start because I've got the microphone. But just, post-COVID, the movement towards having kind of online remote access to lots of things, like educational opportunities, community opportunities. I think that's, I don't think it was specifically for neurodiversity, but I think it's one of the byproducts of kind of like what happened with COVID.
Oh yeah, no, it's huge for like pretty much anyone with a disability. Like it's huge, and it sucks that like there's a lot of places that are pushing to not have that anymore.
Right, or to revert back.
Yeah.
For based on some sort of judgment that it's less than. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the valuing of in-person versus remote is not. It ignores like the accessibility aspect absolutely.
I've seen some pretty successful efforts to have social space be created for people who might feel overstimulated. So, for example, there may be a quieter space. There may be space for more one-on-one, social interaction, because sometimes a bar, a lounge, a party can feel very overstimulating, overwhelming. So I've seen some successful efforts in creating additional space that's quieter in nature and less sensory overload.
Yeah, sensory spaces are huge, and they're definitely becoming more of a thing, and are pretty successful where I've seen them. Anyone else? And it doesn't need to be as big as like remote things or sensory spaces. It could be something that it's more specific. Like another example that is a group, but like would be more casual. Would be like my family, which like some of them know they're neurodivergent, some of them don't. But like when there would be Christmas dinner, like they would have the spicy side of the table and the side of the table for people with bland food. And so like that's an effort to like make the people that have food, the sensory seeking people for taste buds have their side of the table, and the people who are more sensory avoidant with food like are also feel included. And because like there's a bunch of people there that have both, like no one's feeling judged about it. Any other examples?
Yeah. I can talk about in kind of the parenting world, there's actually a bit of a divide, and funnily enough, it kind of sits broadly in sort of the pathology paradigm folk and the sort of affirming paradigm folk, and that is screens and screen time. And especially with kind of kids, and affirming neurodiversity paradigm folk tend to be no screen limits. They see it as a very beneficial option for kind of ways of regulating, ways of seeking education, ways of connecting with others. And those who kind of sit in the pathology paradigm kind of sit there and judge it as a kind of something that needs to be kind of stopped and monitored and I guess I don't know, just seen as something that's damaging. Right.
When I've heard people talk about that, like it's almost like they view it as a form of avoidance.
What do you mean? Using a screen?
You're using a screen, so you're avoiding being social with people.
Yeah. Whereas actually, maybe it's allowing this person to be in the space where that they previously couldn't attend.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And there's actually like some pretty extreme, like not from the parenting world, but like the other year there was someone with an auditory processing issue went to see Hadestown, and they had like the little subtitle thing with them, and one of the actors on stage called them out because they thought it was a cell phone.
Right.
Yeah.
But even just at the dinner table, right?
Yeah.
Allowing screens or not, right? It's a kind of hot topic depending if you've got small kids. If you're at a restaurant and you've got small kids, there's this judgment around kind of screen, but actually it's enabling that whole family to go out for a meal.
Yeah.
Right? And, whatever. And, getting teenagers to the table, maybe they can bring their phone and doom scroll while they're eating, like you're having a meal together, right? Rather than up in the bed. You know what I mean? Who knows, right? But yeah, it's about reframing stuff, right?
Absolutely.
I think, and broadening your view on
broadening your view of what is making something accessible and like what is enabling someone to be there versus like is this just what you consider a problem? Yeah, absolutely. So like what kind of goes with this? So like for when done right, like accessibility and inclusion should be considered in all aspects of an organization's or a group's functioning. So like this is more just considering groups and organizations. So like making an environment inclusive is actively taking steps to make it welcoming and safe for people who experience differences. So like this can include virtue signaling and saying words, but so long as it's not the only thing you're doing and you're actually taking actions to follow it. Like it is important to use the right language and indicate, say you're not using the pathology paradigm, but you also need to back that up with what you're doing too. And then also making practical changes, so like allowing screens at the table or having hybrid options or having a sensory space that help people feel safe. And that can also include like updating policies, engaging in culturally competent practices, which like neurodivergence can be considered a culture, and we'll get to that. Then there's also making the environment accessible means removing or lowering barriers that prevent people from being there. So that can be tangible changes like the sensory space, having multiple communication methods, which can be like with screens, or like if someone hates answering texts, trying to find another way that they are comfortable with, whereas like if someone prefers communicating like hard emotions through texts, letting them do that and not labeling that as like an inferior thing. Offering flexible arrangements, so like being able to adapt, because like people's needs can change based off of how stressed they are, based on like what's going on in the environment, and also people can have conflicting needs too, and just being flexible with that as well. So how to make places more accessible, inclusive. So like actually listening to people with disabilities, like with the parents and the screen time, it sounds like they're labeling it as a problem and not listening to the kids when they say like, this is something I need to be able to be here. And then also just following guidance from actual neurodivergent advocacy groups, because like not everyone wants to have that conversation or is able to have that conversation. So like you can go to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has a bunch of resources for this, and they're really good. Being open to adapting, taking a curiosity-based approach, so understanding why your kid wants to use screens rather than just telling them what to do. And then just being curious and compassionate about the differences rather than judgment. And then this is more like for more structured groups, but having guidance and a plan for if conflict comes up. And that could be helpful in a parenting space, but that can also is generally good for a group. And being consistent with it is huge, because for neurodivergent people, a lot of the time they'll be like, well, they have these rules for the how to handle the conflict, but they didn't follow it. And so now they're more frustrated and angry, and that can get things to escalate because they don't understand why things are different. And then just being open to feedback. So like if someone says they're confused, like updating the policies to be clearer, or just sitting down and explaining with them. So what makes you think that neurodivergent inclusion is important? Like why is this something people should be doing or making an effort for?
Well, I learned something new today, which was about the like innate versus acquired neurodiversity. So if I'm kind of thinking from that perspective, there's so much more neurodiversity than I think we realized from a lot of different sources. So inclusion would be really important, because we're just trying to make space for as many people as possible and make different things more accessible and more welcoming to like probably a larger population than we realize that is neurodivergent. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is huge. Like, there's definitely like a larger number of people who are like not getting included or getting exhausted by having to compensate than like people tend to realize, just because they have this one idea of what neurodivergence is. And I will also say, with like the understanding of neurodiversity, there is like definitely an emphasis on being autistic there, and that is because the neurodiversity movement came out of the autistic community, so they've had more time to figure out what that means for them. Yeah. No, oh, Maddie has hand raised.
Oh, sorry.
One of the things is that you also get advantages of different perspectives in the world, because neurodiversity means different ways of thinking, different ways of processing information that can have different benefits that are often ignored when you consider it from the pathological model. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be one.
Yeah, absolutely, like increasing creativity and ideas.
I also think this is a social value that's being put into action, because I think the value is that all people inherently have value. And when we talk about welcoming people, if you don't create inclusion, then you're actually putting roadblocks, and it's a form of willing ignorance or purposeful oppression. So I think that by having the awareness and making the inclusion and accessibility an important part of the work, you're actually putting a value into action.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually kind of leads into, y'all took a very strengths-based approach. I kind of took more of like the neurodivergent people still have many barriers, and that leads to adverse outcomes one, just because like that is so dire right now that like we want to get to the point where like we're getting all of those strengths, but right now people are so excluded that like it's hard for them to even get there. So like neurodivergent children and teens generally get higher rates of bullying, lack accommodations, and experience more social isolation and less social support. After leaving school, there are almost no services for neurodivergent adults without intellectual disabilities, and with the way the government's going, it's probably not going to be services for adults in general. Realistically, and I put that there because there's a much higher estimate that is unrealistic. Autistic people have an unemployment rate of around 35%. There is a study that says it's 70%, but that is very flawed. Don't believe that number. And this is likely due to discrimination and lack of accessibility and things like job interviews being discriminatory, et cetera. And then likely due to a lack of support and inclusive environments, neurodivergent people are more likely to be victimized across the lifespan. And that's victimized like in any interpersonal relationship, be that a friendship, be that a romantic relationship, be that a working relationship. They're more likely to experience different forms of victimization within those. And then because of that, neurodivergent people are more likely to have co-occurring mental health conditions because, yay, chronic stress, and then also physical health problems that have been linked with chronic stress, like autoimmune diseases, gastrointestinal problems, and chronic pain disorders. And it's also very interesting to see how these are discussed depending on like the view of the researcher has of neurodivergent people, because like for autistic people, they'll be like, these things are highly correlated, and they'll blame it on being autistic without considering the chronic stress part of things, even though in any other population, it's just like, that's chronic stress, which is kind of wild. Yeah, and then neurodivergent people are also at risk of experiencing neurodivergent burnout, which is burnout where like they lose skills and just the ability to function in general. Like it's not just a feeling of being burned out, it's literally not being able to function that lasts for 6 months or more. And then likely as a result of all of these, around 1 in 3 autistic adults without intellectual disability have reported suicidal ideation, and 1 in 4 have reported making a suicide attempt across their lifetime. And it is and suicide is the highest, the biggest cause of early premature mortality in the autistic population. And people with ADHDers have similar numbers. Other neurodivergent populations, we don't have those numbers really. So it's a huge thing just in terms of survival that this gets prioritized more. Like it's a social value, but also just like, if we want people to be living longer and being able to just survive, let alone thrive, like inclusion and accessibility needs to be a higher priority for this population. Yeah, so just takeaways, like inclusion should go beyond awareness, acceptance, and tolerance, and should include active steps to support and include neurodivergent people. Accessibility encompasses many considerations, including different types of accessibility needs based on disabilities and other barriers. And inclusion and accessibility efforts should include the perspectives of the given population, should be consistent and should also be flexible enough to adapt to different people's needs. And then being intentionally inclusive and accessible for neurodivergent people is important due to systemic and social discrimination that leads to adverse health outcomes. Quick check-in, I know that we kind of took a turn to the darker part at the end of that. So just how are we feeling, and any comments, questions on that? We have a...
Yeah, I was thinking about your previous question, why is inclusion important? And something I wanted to touch on was if you compare it to representation of minority and marginalized groups, I'm thinking in particular of the talk within the trans community about the importance of not just trans representation, but accurate representation, and why it matters, especially I'm late diagnosed autistic. In fact, I did not even think to get it screened until after I came out as non-binary, and it was because I found out about the high level of correlation. Despite the fact that I've been living with disability with significant support needs for most of my life, I just didn't know what it was due to. The importance of representation, just seeing other people who might be like you out there, seeing them accepted, seeing that there is a space for them, and you don't have to hide it or just, as I thought I had to, tough it out, or, why can't you be, normal like everyone else? I was especially told, oh yeah, I had the same problems, I dealt with it, why can't you? I'm sure a lot of people have heard that. I think there is inherent value in just seeing that there are people out there being themselves, that it's okay to be who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely falls into inclusion and representation too. Seeing more people like you and seeing that people like you can have support and can have like a successful life is huge. And unfortunately, neurodivergent representation has not been great. There are honestly a lot more better autistically coded characters than there are autistic characters. Pretty similar for ADHD as well. And while that can be great for people who know to seek that out, like it also can leave a lot of people feeling very isolated because like everyone expects them to be a stereotype but doesn't understand anything beyond that. Any other thoughts on inclusion and accessibility, or just the reasons it's important? I know I brought up a lot of statistics at the end too, if we want to talk about those more.
Although I was a bit reluctant, which is why I sort of almost didn't, but the suicidality thing, I was a bit reluctant to talk about it because it's a very kind of dark space, right?
Yeah.
And the outcomes, as you spoke about the statistics for neurodivergent folk. But I think about our sort of models for care for the neurodivergent community, and how it kind of interweaves. I'm just sort of like brainstorming, bear with me, but this idea of like, toxic positivity, right? And how you marry and useful code switching / masking, and being authentic in space, and how one can be authentically kind of in a very dark space and still access the world, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, not have to go to social gatherings and like put on a brave smile or put on a smile, or like code switch, but can kind of be active in either depression, or even I work with some folks where we speak about suicidality really it's on a dial, where it goes from kind of on good days it's not there, on average days it's there quite a bit, on very poor times it's there a lot, and kind of figuring out where they are on that kind of dial. But because living in a neurotypical world for a neurodivergent person is all sorts of painful, right? It just is.
Yes.
You just have to, and so I know that in a lot of the neurodiversity affirming training programs that I've been to, one of the key or needs that was kind of expressed was just therapeutic spaces that could really sit with and hold suicidality, and risk, I guess, in that. And I think there is a lack of that in neurodiversity, in sort of neurotypical therapeutic spaces. I think there's a real lack of that. I think there's a real urge to fix that, to make that okay. And it can prompt a neurodivergent person to code switch very quickly into toxic positivity, and that becomes a piece of masking, right? So I think it's nuanced, and I think it's difficult to even speak about, even kind of in, kind of spaces like this. But I think it's worth thinking about just this idea that actually somebody can access therapeutic help and sit in years and years and years of kind of, quite a dark time, but just holding space for that, right, without having to fix it, right, and that's okay. Yeah, I don't know, any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's huge, because I know also, like, in terms of there are some very interesting resources, like, for hotlines that have been made around this, which generally, like, tend to operate from a pathology paradigm. But, like, a big thing that they bring up with, like, why this can be more intense, at least for autistic people, is, like, rumination and, like, fixating on a thought. And a lot of the things, a lot of, like, the solutions we're trained for with, like, suicidality are very much like, oh, distract yourself, or like they're not for people who like hyperfixate on something and have trouble switching gears. So like being able to stay in that space with them and like hold it is definitely a lot more important, just because of how brains work. Yeah, and then there's also just the overlap with like whenever I see those statistics, I also just think about the large overlap between the neurodivergent community and the trans community, and both have very high rates, and it support it, and there's also just the fact that like a lot of therapeutic spaces, it's kind of like there's focusing on fixing it and not acknowledging that like this is due to some things that like we can't fix within a therapy session.
You're making me think of something related, somewhat tangential. I often see adolescents who have a propensity toward being on their own and staying, let's say, in their room, and the parents will call in or sit with the therapist and express a lot of distress that their child is withdrawing and isolating. And when you meet with the young person, they themselves are not distressed by being on their own, and yet it's the adults around them who very much think that this is wrong, pathological, or depression, or not right, and want their young person, their child, to be socializing in a more neurotypical way. And so I feel like this is something that doesn't get enough sort of attention, and it often creates sort of tension within the therapeutic relationship, because the parent has an agenda, and the agenda is for the therapist to get their child to be more neurotypical and socializing, when in fact the child is not, they're distressed about other things, and in fact probably distressed about the pressure being put on them to conform to parental expectations. But this is something that comes up quite frequently.
Yeah, but you can get a similar dynamic with the therapist. Right, and having similar kind of neurotypical demands, how unconscious or not, right?
Yeah, no, a lot of neurodivergent people like report going to like people who do CBT, and that like being a huge problem, just because like the person wants to correct them to have a more neurotypical belief system when that's just not how they're processing things, and also that's not reflective of their experience.
Can I just say something about that, though?
Yeah.
Sorry, because you spot something, because I worked with somebody who had multiple neurodivergencies, and we actually looked at treatment options for that. They were struggling with contamination OCD. They ended up opting for CBT for OCD. Right,
yeah.
Within the construct of us understanding that sits firmly kind of in the pathology paradigm, and they had great outcomes actually. So it was really interesting how they accessed that piece of treatment that is, we kind of stereotype that as it's not a stereotype, it is pathology paradigm based, right, and behaviourist, but they kind of were able to access what they needed from it and kind of come back to, and you found it very useful. So it's interesting, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely goes back to it being a spectrum there.
Yeah.
And probably also helps they had an otherwise neuroaffirming therapist helping them with it.
Right, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what was just said about how you might need to provide a space for depression, for those thoughts. One of the struggles I faced seeking psychotherapy is that because so many of them rely on the pathologized model, you can't ever talk about your worst depressive feelings without them going into full-blown panic mode and saying, well, you need to be on this, and this drugs, or you need to go to the hospital, or I'm going to call 262 help and the cops are going to come. And all I really was interested in was, I just need space to talk my way through it, and you're supposed to be helping me with this. But they hear those trigger words, and they immediately go on red alert. I have been involuntarily institutionalized before as a result of this. I did not have any intent, but they read into it what they wanted to hear. And this has also happened, this has happened among my friends who they're neurodivergent themselves, but whenever I'm going through an episode, they just panic and start pleading with me. And that completely breaks down all communication. And then I very much do have to, I have to cut this off myself. I have to code switch. I have to put the mask on that they want to see so that I don't worry them, so that we can even continue our interaction in the first place, because the whole reason I'm talking to them is because I needed to talk it through. I think that because the inherent assumption is that you use the pathologized model, everyone sees it that way, and everyone just assumes that the worst is going to happen. And ironically, it comes across as very dismissive.
Yeah, well, first, I'm really sorry that you had the experience of being involuntary institutionalized for not having intent. Unfortunately, that's a common story, particularly for neurodivergent people, just because of the communication differences and also the training. And you're absolutely right with people panicking and not knowing how to handle it. That's somewhat due to pathologizing, also just stigma, and it sounds like a lot of the time you're doing emotional labor for other people as a result, which is not helpful when you're already in a dark place.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on, I think that's what's so problematic about some aspects of our code of ethics and our profession is that we hear these terms. I don't know about others, but I left grad school with a fear. If this happens, I have to do this, right? The importance of being a mandated reporter, while knowing that students that I've sent out for clearances are likely never going to tell me any real feeling that they're having, for fear of, ringing the alarm and, having these difficult conversations with parents and providers. So yeah, I think it's really problematic that we can't always offer a safe space in terms of talking about suicide and and self-harm and things like that.
Yeah, no, we're definitely put in a very uncomfortable position in terms of that, and also in schools with mandated reporting also for abuse and what is considered abuse. And I had a client this week who got CPS got called. The client was 18 and CPS got called from school because the mom wasn't picking up the kids soon enough for being sick. It's just a wild choice. Yes, that face. Yeah.
It's funny, I think because there's such heightened awareness around abuse and suicide and neglect, the pendulum has swung the other direction. So there's only one option, like Ari was talking about, that if you hear someone talk about suicide or suspected abuse, that immediately there is no other option. And I was just taking a CEU program on this topic, and we are mandated within 24 hours to report it. And yet it doesn't address the more nuanced understanding of who someone is. And I'm curious, being in graduate school yourself, do you feel in terms of the education that you're receiving, how much consciousness is there among the instruction about neurodivergency and how that might look differently according to who your client is?
There's no awareness for this,
I see.
except when I bring it up. Yeah, that is still very much shifting. There's also just the fun fact that like they only talk about things like being autistic or ADHD when talking about children, because obviously neurodivergent adults don't exist. Yeah, no, there's the curriculum isn't yet to incorporate this paradigm in any way, shape, or form. Even though, like for social work, like that is very in line with the social work code of ethics.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're done with this, I did have like a quick break here. Do we want a break, or do we want to keep going?
Can we take a 5-minute break?
Yep.
That'd be great.
Okay, so for this section, we're going to go through a couple theories and case examples of just neurodivergent experiences in groups and organizations, and this is mainly highlighting aspects of social dynamics and like theories that describe the social dynamics that neurodivergent people come into. Like I said before, like this is mainly like theories that were based on autistic people, so that that is the main population it represents, but it does, a lot of them can apply to other groups as well, other neurodivergent groups as well. We're presenting these because like, we're presenting these first because neurodivergent people often, these social dynamics often present initial barriers to neurodivergent people being included, like with a job. An interview, the social dynamics of an interview will prevent you from being there if you're at a school, or like you go to a peer support group, like how people's first impressions of you might will affect like how included you are, how much effort people make to include you. So that's important. Like a lot of emphasis does go on the sensory stuff and the processing stuff, and we've gone over that previously. And we'll have slides with more information for those who aren't here. But like this often gets overlooked and underdescribed and is misunderstood, and usually the neurodivergent person is just considered the problem for not fitting in. Different social dynamics here can be affected differently by different intersectional identities and just different experiences and just different types of neurodivergence. Like me being hyperverbal means I often get treated differently than someone who may be less verbal. And these do not represent something experienced by every neurodivergent person. That's, no theory is going to do that. And also neurotypical people can have some aspects of these experiences as well. So the first theory is one, for those who've been at the other ones, we've touched on before, so the double empathy problem. So it's a concept that was developed by a autistic a sociologist. It's based off of research that found that in groups, in small groups, non-autistic people had just as many communication problems when talking to autistic people as the autistic people did. And then like when they went to play telephone, when it was a group of all non-autistic people and a group of all autistic people, both groups performed around the same. Problems only emerged when they mixed the two groups together. So it's for both groups, like they just have different communication styles that work well with each other, but don't mix very easily. And so this introduces a problem because like in any one-on-one or group interaction, like there's this implicit social contract of like we're both going to make an effort to understand each other in this communication and meet each other where we're at. But because neurotypical people are in the majority, they will see, they might not make that effort with a neurodivergent person as much just because it's so different. And so they'll just be like, oh, the neurodivergent person isn't trying, so they're the problem. And as a result, the neurodivergent person now has to do the empathizing of two people to get that interaction to be effective. And like this can be applicable to a lot of minority communication styles. So like if you come from a different cultural background, like you'll get deemed a problem because you're different from the majority, etc. So like what does this look like? So someone saying like they're just is so rude, I don't really know how to connect with them. I don't know if we should invite her. She doesn't talk a lot and I'm not sure she'd like it. He's constantly moving his hands in class, he just makes me anxious. She's so self-centered, all they talk about is themselves and that one show they're into. So like just seeing those different communication styles and making these baseline assumptions off of it, that makes the other person the problem, and if they want to be included, they have to go an extra step to make up for that. So how have you seen this show up in different social groups? If at all?
I grapple with figuring out why I'm dysregulated, translating that into a neurotypical language, communicating it to the neurotypical person I'm with, and giving them ways to help with that, also while being mindful of their mental and physical state. Right?
Yep.
And that's kind of, you know, a sort of hourly occurrence, generally speaking, depending on who I'm interacting with. Right? Yeah. So that's what I experience personally, is like the double empathy problem, and how it's very rare for me to be on the receiving end of something like that.
Yeah, and then there's such a high percentage of neurodivergent people in therapy, and you wonder why. You're already used to that work. Anyone else in day-to-day life or just observing. I know for me, like I often get like the you talk like a textbook kind of thing and become the homework friend in school. And then there's just not a lot of like social invites because you're the textbook homework friend. Just because I talk a lot in a very academic way. And like this can vary from presentations. So then another theory that's kind of similar to this, and this one I don't have a source because I've heard many people reference it, but none of them have said where it's written. But which is funny because it's the unwritten social rulebook. So it's the idea that like there's this unwritten set of rules that we have in any given social interaction. So like you start with hello. You ask small talk, you start by asking how someone is. What topics are acceptable for small talk? Like these are all generally unwritten rules. There's probably a self-help book that covers some of them, but like that will still vary from room to room and environment to environment. The idea is that like neurotypical people from a very young age are wired more to pick that up more naturally, whereas neurodivergent people pick that up less naturally. And so that means that they're more likely to just do basic faux pas of just like, oh, I didn't realize I needed to wear black to a wedding because no one told me that directly. They just assumed I knew it. And so that can lead to a lot of embarrassment and shame, and also just like them getting excluded because like, oh, how did you not know this basic thing that we all know? And then this can get exacerbated in environments like a workplace or school where there is actually, or even like an online forum where there are actually written rules, and then people don't follow them because of the unwritten social rule book, or those rules will get enforced inconsistently because of the unwritten social rule book. So it's like, okay, you said any like hate speech won't be tolerated, and they used this word, and I pointed it out to you, but now I'm in trouble. Why did that happen with this kind of deal? And no one, if they view that as them being a problem rather than like them generally not understanding. So like in terms of what this can look like, apparently I was supposed to respond and let them know I got the message, but no one told me to do that, so I didn't, and now they're angry at me. My coworker didn't follow the policy, so I reported to my boss, but apparently they usually let that slide. Then why write it down? Why did you tell me to report this to my boss if I shouldn't? And why are you acting like I caused a problem here? I told the moderators that these people in the groups were using slurs because that's against the rules, and then I was kicked out for bullying because I pointed it out to them. Everyone was making jokes until the movie started. Then I continued to do so to fit in, but apparently I was wrong. I got in trouble for continuing to make jokes during the movie, even though everyone was doing it. And these are like more basic examples, but like they're ones that I know I and other people I know have experienced throughout life. Has anyone else run into this for like just not knowing the social rule book? Yes.
So I was hiring a photographer for my wedding, and did not realize that I was supposed to, like, after agreeing to it, like, confirm it with the photographer, and like a week beforehand found out the photographer thought they were not doing my wedding. And I needed to find a new photographer.
That is so stressful. I'm sorry.
Yep.
I had to fight the urge before going to a social gathering to literally say, what's the purpose of this meeting? I went for brunch with a couple of friends recently, and I stopped myself because I was like, I'm going to like behave or whatever. And I still at the end came where I was like, I wonder what the purpose of that was, but apparently it was to just have brunch, but
Yep.
you know, well.
Yeah, that's a big one. I will say this one is often compared to like being an expat in another country, and like there are some people online that like give the advice of like, yeah, honestly, it's easier to be neurodivergent if you move to another country because then they just assume the reason you don't know the social rules is that you're in another country.
I'll definitely lean into that. I could so embrace my like awkwardness. I fit in way better here because I got an excuse for being awkward AF, basically.
Yeah, and that kind of goes with like thinking about neurodivergence more from a cultural competence angle might be helpful in a lot of cases. Like how do we have cultural competence for neurodivergent people rather than just deeming their behavior as a problem, or them doing faux pas as a problem. Any other examples that people have? Okay. So then this all then leads to neurodivergent masking. So this is very similar to code switching, Beth Ann has brought up a couple times. So neurodivergent masking is when someone who is neurodivergent works to hide their neurodivergent traits in order to better fit in with a neurotypical society. So this can be done in a couple ways. So compensating for differences. Trying to make up for areas that you find challenging by working extra hard. So writing everything down because you know you won't remember it, or sharing it, or staring at someone's eyebrows so it looks like you're making eye contact if that's hard for you. Scripting and mimicry. A lot of autistic people in particular report learning social cues by watching TV and scripting based off of that and mimicking their conversations based off of that, which can sometimes also lead to problems just because that's not how actual conversations work. And but it does help to minimize anxiety and just the risk of saying something that doesn't fit once you get a better sense of things. And then a big one is sensory suppression, so keeping yourself from stimming. Ignoring distress about stimuli. A lot of, and particularly AFAB autistic people, like will report like only being able to have meltdowns at home because they've internalized suppressing that so much. And then seeking, and also like suppressing the need to seek sensory stimuli that might be helpful. So like if you're somewhere where like you can't access like moving around, you're just like, okay, I won't do that. Or you can't bring like your tinted glasses. You're like, okay, then I will deal with bright lights. And just having to work around that. So I will, just some notes on this, like almost everyone of all neurotypes masks, I tend to use more of a neuroperformativity model where there's like this neurotypical ideal that no one will reach. And neurotypical people have an easier time performing to that, and it's just that neurodivergent people find it harder to do so. And while masking can get some level of social, financial, or emotional safety, it's often at the expense of long-term well-being because it can lead to like things like autistic burnout or like physical health issues from chronic stress. Because of this, it is important for neurodivergent people to have places where they feel included and accepted, even when expressing their neurodivergent traits. And at the same time, unmasking at all times is unrealistic and is always an option, especially those with other marginalized identities, where you could get profiled or just you could lose a job because of unmasking. So like it's a difficult line to balance of just like you need spaces where you can unmask, but also like you're probably going to need to mask at some point if you can. And it's also important to say not all neurodivergent people can mask. So what does this look like? People in a group only knowing it, like a neurodivergent person very superficially, like, oh, they seem nice. I can't think of anything else to say about them because they're always just like saying very scripted things. A neurodivergent person having what appear to be good relationships, but feeling very lonely because they're not being their full selves. And these relationships are actually very anxiety producing for them. A neurodivergent person socializing well for a few weeks, months, years, but then just crashing and like losing the ability to do that because they just lost the capacity to mask. And then someone having a lot of social activities but finding them all draining just because they are so much work. For time, I'm going to skip the how have you seen this shown up question. And we'll skip the break here and go on to this one, which I really like this theory. So it's group-based identity versus value-based identity. It's a theory developed by Tara Vance on Neuroclastic. Neuroclastic is a site that's by and for autistic people. Tara Vance, I really like in general and highly recommend reading her. She is also an autistic sociologist. And according to this theory by her, most neurotypical people have a group-based identity. So they're like, I identify as a nurse, and so I do everything that nurses do. Or I identify as someone who knits, and so everything I do is around knitting. And whatever people say about knitting is an attack on the group, and therefore it is an attack on me. By contrast, many neurodivergent people have values-based identities. So they primarily associate their identities with their values and interests. So like you'll see this show up in a lot of neurodiversity advocacy as like neurodivergent people being more social justice oriented, which is a bit inaccurate and seems to ignore like the high rate of incels that are autistic. But incels are also values-based. They don't have healthy values, but they are values-based identities. So they're they find a set of beliefs and they hold that close to them, and that is how they build themselves and their identity, and they want a world that is consistent with those beliefs, and they want to act consistently with those beliefs. And these can come into a conflict when a group's identity conflicts with a neurodivergent person's values. So what does this look like? So this is from Tara Vance. So Rita and Liz, they're both heterosexual middle-class Latinx women. They're both EMTs. They're both spouses and mothers. They're both musicians, and they're both Christians, and both put a particular emphasis on identifying as EMTs and Christians, and they work in the same precinct. The only difference is Rita is neurotypical and Liz is neurodivergent. So then when the city decides to update their budget and decrease funding for emergency services so they can increase funding for communities services, they're going to react differently, especially when articles announcing this have comment in the comments, accusations of ineffective resource use by first responders, mistreatment of those accessing services, and racist comments and bias in general by first responders. So like Rita, with her group-based identity as a neurotypical person, feels like a core part of her identity is being attacked both by the budget cuts and also the comments on how first responders may not always be doing a good job. And so she feels the collective group she is a part of is being undervalued. And as a result, she starts organizing a fundraiser to support that group and to boost morale for that group. And then at the next department meeting, she suggests a public relations campaign to improve public perception so her group is no longer getting attacked. In contrast, Liz, who values saving lives and so wants to do the thing that will save the most lives, researches the impact of these budget changes and makes note on the community feedback in the comments for her department. And then she organizes a fundraiser to support the community and get a better sense of what they need. And at the next department meeting, she suggests that first responders use downtime to get crisis intervention and bias training, and also for the department to develop more ways to support healthy community engagement so that there's less mistreatment and bias in these responses. So how do you think the department responded to these things? These two different responses to a complicated situation.
Probably responded to probably supported Rita's position rather than Liz's.
Yep. Yeah. No. Rita, superiors and colleagues in the meeting praised Rita for being a team player, and then they accused Liz of not caring about her job, and she's generally treated like a problem. And so, like, I bring this up because, like, every autistic person I've brought this up to, like, relates. Most ADHDers I bring this up to, like, really relates to it. Like, they've had a dynamic where, like, they're like, I'm in this group because of an interest, or I'm in this group because it's a job, and I have these values that I think that we should bring to it too. And when they bring up a problem, they're then treated as a problem because they're more likely to bring it up because they have a values-based identity versus just identifying with the group that they're in. Have any of you seen or experienced this kind of dynamic?
I think we're seeing this politically right now.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Elon Musk, for example, in terms of needing to slash the federal budget. And so very sort of laser focused on that, but not necessarily aware of the impact that it's having on the larger, on a individual person or a family or a community. So, for Elon Musk, it's very focused on...
The value is make the government as small as possible.
Correct.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Like this is a very social justice oriented extreme, but that is also the other end of that extreme. Like it can go both ways. Yeah. And that also probably is, we can see like there's a negative reaction to that because it's bad, but also just a negative reaction even from the people he's working with to how he's doing it because of his approach.
I just want to echo that let's talk about when I worked for the health service in the UK, there's definitely kind of this keep quiet and we keep our jobs right, kind of culture, even though it oftentimes doesn't feel like efficient. We used to call it like busy, which was kind of like act busy, right? And it's that kind of, it used to cause me such like internal pain, right? Like we're acting busy, it's like to stay employed. It's felt a little weird and off, right? But I think that's like a cultural and maybe a neurotypical thing. I don't know.
I feel like that's a work environment thing almost. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, that definitely is a work environment where it would be harder for a neurodivergent person because that's like extreme masking. Yeah. No.
If you call it out, if you call it out, like you're ostracized, right? You're just like, you're not one of us.
Yeah, I guess like for me, like a recent example I have a client who is in a lot of online groups that are like try to expose scammers, and then they saw someone who was trying to sell Bitcoin, and they were like, and the way they were doing it, they pointed out to moderators, "Hi, we're a group that's fighting scammers, and this person seems to be selling a scam," and they proceeded to be kicked out of the group for raising a problem. Yeah, so it's so like they were there for a value, but the other people were there to just identify with the group. Or another one, this seems to happen in online. It gets heightened in online spaces. But like another client of mine has a special interest in a specific band, and there was a controversy in there just about people drawing pictures that involved sexual acts with minors, and like people were debating it because it was fictional, and whereas my client was just like, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't do it, and was like blocking people as a result of that because like the group shared the interest in the band and clearly did not share those values. In the same morals, so and that was physically painful for them. So like this can show up in a lot of different ways. Do we have any other comments on this one? Yep.
Yeah, just briefly. When you talk about this dichotomy of identities. Does that apply to innate identities, or is it mostly just social identities?
I mean, like this is a model of social identity. Like it's literally the article is the identity theory of autism, so it's definitely more of a social identity approach. And like they do say, like not all neurodivergent people may experience this. It just seems like it's more likely that they will process things that way, due to a number of things. But like neurotypical people do have values too. And like you could even see this like with PTSD, like people with PTSD generally like will act more in line with certain values. Those values may not always be in line with reality, but like they'll align with that more than a group. So like it will vary. Okay, so then we've got one more, which is just covering being neurodivergent and otherwise marginalized. So people with other marginalized identities who are neurodivergent are often under-identified as neurodivergent or labeled as inaccurate forms of neurodivergence due to stigma or different presentations. So you've got, you've got Black and Latina people getting labeled as ODD versus ADHD, or getting put in the school to prison pipeline rather than getting a diagnosis. You get AFAB people getting diagnosed with borderline personality disorder when they're autistic. There are a lot of ways that can manifest, and this happens due to stigma and bias from practitioners, and also people referring you to practitioners. Testing biases, differences in how neurodivergent it presents just due to like social pressures and what you're exposed to socially, language barriers and cultural differences. Being under-identified and at the intersection of other forms of marginalizations means those who are both neurodivergent and otherwise marginalized have less access to support and community and are at greater risk of isolation and victimization. Depending on the overlapping identities, individuals in these groups may also be at greater risk for police violence, incarceration, or other forms of institutional violence. And I will say in general, there's one study that found that half of all people who experience police violence have a disability in general. So like this is bigger than neurodivergence there, but like is definitely aggravated if you are, say, BIPOC and neurodivergent, or BIPOC and disabled, or LGBTQ and disabled, or all three of those. Having more than one form of marginalization can mean needing to compromise when accessing spaces related to one identity or another, and having identities that include physical disabilities or chronic illnesses, being low income, can significantly just affect the ability to access support. Because it's like, okay, do I go get my medical care, or do I go and pay for like an executive functioning coach, or like go and access this, get access to the sensory thing? Is the sensory thing safe for my physical disability or chronic illness? So what this can look like, having your neurodivergent traits fit into something that's a racial profile or stereotype, being excluded from communities that different identities belong to and never really feeling like you fully fit in, having difficulty finding identity-specific spaces that are accessible. So like if all of the identity-specific spaces are in loud, noisy environments and like you can't process anything there, you're just kind of left on your own, needing to choose what identities to be out with. So like prior to grad school, at my last job, I was out as non-binary and I was not out as autistic, just because I didn't want to put in the work for that. Not having, and then just not having information on neurodivergence to share with relatives that's written in a language that they understand, or being able to have them advocate for you. And then maybe navigating two culture stereotypes or stigmas. So like if you're a neurodivergent person with like food sensitivities and who's like sensory avoidant with food and doesn't like spicy food, but you grew up in a culture that only has spicy food, you're probably going to get a lot of judgment, versus like if you go to like a more an environment where they have blander food, that might not be as much of an issue. So like kind of navigating like two different rules around that. Yeah, and we'll skip the question. Yep. Yep.
This came up with a family that I was working with, because culturally the expectation is that the grandchildren are supposed to kiss their grandmother, and the grandmother's very tactilely focused. And one of the children did not respond well to the tactile stimulation, and yet culturally it was expected. And so you have one parent who said, this is a sign of respect. And when your grandmother wants to, hold you, you let her. And the other parent said, no, we can't teach our child, to not be in touch with their own needs. And so it's interesting how the cultural and the neurodivergency kind of collided.
Yeah, no, and that can get very complicated, like depending on like what cultural background, or like if there are parents from two cultures and you have to navigate both of those, and also it can be very hard to unravel like what is a cultural expectation and what is my sensory needs too. Do we have any other examples for this one? Okay. Just so because we don't have a lot of time. Yep.
There's certain work situations, usually not in our profession, but where there may be an expectation that you take a client out and socialize with them, and you take them to a go-go bar, or you take them to a baseball game, or, and I can imagine that there may be certain individuals who respond well to that, and then other neurodivergent people who would really struggle with that, and yet their professional evaluation and their professional success may be compromised because they're being asked to participate in acts that are not consistent with what inherently feels right for them.
Yeah, no, I actually have, prior to grad school I was working in healthcare advertising, which has a lot of neurodivergent people, I think, just because you get creative, and then you also can go on research rabbit holes. But also there was a lot of this conflicts with our values, because a lot of the people there, just also because it's New York, were also very leftist and not into big pharma. And so you're working a job that conflicts with it, and it's kind of like with any neurotype, it will vary from person to person, your tolerance for that. And if you're doing work outside of there, it might be easier for you to deal with that if you have that model and framework. or like for someone that might be completely intolerable, so like they just wouldn't work in that field to begin with. Yeah, so just like, so how do we counteract these social dynamics? Like if you're a neurotypical person, or like even if you're a neurodivergent person who might have some internalized ableism. So just try to assume good intentions for people who don't fit exact social norms is a huge thing. Like if someone it doesn't fit social norms, like at first assume they're an expat from a different place, or treat them like that and treat them with the same curiosity you would have for that. Like if someone says something harmful, obviously, like and they continue to do so after it's explained, like obviously your curiosity doesn't need to go beyond that. But like assuming good intentions from the start and leading with curiosity and being open to accommodating people is a huge first step. And also just being vocal about accepting them so that they don't feel pressure to mask, and being open about like being willing to change things to meet their preferences, so there is less pressure to do that automatic switch into masking. Making an effort to understand the experiences and needs of neurodivergent people, and also like doing trainings to address existing biases, and then having a clear way to handle conflict that is consistent and collaborative. Just to try and keep things from escalating, because like if someone has mainly experienced negative social interactions, they're more likely to withdraw or escalate things very quickly, and so having clear expectations and keeping those consistent so they know what to do just makes it feel more comfortable, and less like a re-traumatizing experience. So yeah, takeaways: we went over the double empathy problem, the unwritten social rulebook, masking and hiding neurodivergent traits, a values-based identity versus a group-based identity, and then how neurodivergent people with other marginalized identities may have a more complex social terrain and difficulty finding in places that include all of themselves. And so this last section is relatively quick. So like the last section just does a broad overview of accommodations for other things, just because like those are still important, even if this emphasizes social dynamics. Different accommodations for processing differences, sensory differences, executive functioning differences, and communication differences. I am trying to keep an eye on time here, so like we could go through those really quickly, or if people would prefer to have it because y'all have the slides, you can also read those. So we could go through those, or if people would prefer, we could have more of a discussion, or people could ask more specific questions about like how to deal with these social dynamics, or about any of the frameworks we went over. Does anyone have a preference? Okay. Does anyone have any burning questions that they are going to want to ask before the end of this? Is probably.
Yeah, I was thinking. Oh, sorry. When I came in, you know, obviously the sort of umbrella. Like, what is the purpose of this meeting? I'm like, well, I was thinking about community, right? And I was thinking about neurodiversity affirming community spaces, and in specifically I was thinking about, you know, community spaces that I've tried to start, like with equality mental health, and that I've kind of fizzled out. And I'm thinking about spaces that we can make that are accommodating and meet the needs of our neurodivergent, whatever folks are kind of hoping to access those spaces. And so I would love a chance to kind of brainstorm that, because I'm very kind of pragmatic, and would love to think about, you know, how can we take all of this and actually create a space that's potentially useful for neurodivergent folks. Because that was what I was thinking about when, you know, the idea of kind of community and neurodivergent community. I was thinking of maybe coming to some kind of just having, you know, some direction with that, right? Yeah, no, that seems like it would be a really good discussion to close this out. Do other people like that? I mean, I can talk about what didn't work, what seemed to fizzle out. So I started a Neuroqueer group. I didn't call it a social group, but it was, you know, I mean, you know, and I sort of, it was at a lunchtime, so on a Monday, which I guess like the time of day, it was the most accommodating that I could kind of do, right, which was, you know, potentially kind of break time for people. And it was, I offered it for in-person and remote kind of access. And I had real trouble kind of getting it off the ground and, you know, having it kind of stick. And I think about that, and I think about kind of what went wrong, and there were kind of individual circumstances with the participants, and accessibility issues were like literally having transport to the place, for example, and or not being able to kind of respond to text messages. That was a big thing. Like I had one participant who was like, "Oh, you texted, so I just don't look at texts," right? So we had kind of had to think about that, and I was thinking about. And that was a very kind of conventional group in terms of, this group was offered. It was at a kind of a time that seemed accessible. It was kind of lunchtime, midweek, and I offered it online and in person, but it still didn't really take off, right? And I was willing to kind of like change the day or whatever and kind of figure that out, but there was something about it that just wasn't good enough, or wasn't the right fit. And then something came up recently. I was going to brainstorm with Craig about designing a group that was around body doubling, so a body doubling group, and thinking out loud about this idea, what is the purpose of this group, and if there's a purpose, maybe attendance will feel more accessible, or I don't know. So that's where I'm at with it, and thinking about developing a group that's neurodiversity affirming, a space to bring all things neurodiversity, but that maybe has a goal, maybe doesn't. I don't know. Any thoughts?
One thing that came to mind is that typically when I'm like starting a group, I have participants create rules and parameters and boundaries themselves, as opposed to me being like, when someone's speaking, the other person doesn't speak, like having that investment and being able to come up with those boundaries, but also allowing that to be a conversation that we revisit every time, right? If something comes up, if someone is feeling uncomfortable, that they have the opportunity to say I noticed that we don't have a rule about this and it's making me uncomfortable. Can I do that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm gonna give this back to you because I feel like.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm trying to think how we navigated things that way. I don't know, there was something broader that just didn't cut it, and I can't figure it out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm wondering, like there's the having conversation about rules. That might also be a good time to also talk about what would make it accessible to them. Like in terms of do you prefer text messages? Like if you ask it up front, they might be, you could avoid that faux pas and or not faux pas, but just that miscommunication. Yeah. But I think your point about there being a clear purpose to it might be really helpful, just in terms of interest-driven, interest-based nervous systems and values-driven people. Just having it based off of an identity might not keep people coming regularly.
Yeah, and I work with a lot of folk, and I also struggle myself with executive functioning stuff, and life skilling, right, and doing life admin that is too boring to go near. And I know there are a lot of online body doubling spaces.
Yes. And
I wonder if that might be a really useful space to offer.
I mean, I can think of at least one client who would be very eager for that.
It's so interesting, right? Yeah. Where can I just go and get the stuff done that I really don't want to deal with?
Yeah.
And that other people are doing their stuff as well. And that could look like anything, right? From I have to clean the bathroom, to I have to file my taxes, to I have to send that email, to I have to, whatever it is, I don't know. I mean, insert X, right? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think, I'm curious if the body doubling would work. I'm wondering, when you say something didn't click, was it just the personalities didn't click, or just people weren't coming?
Attendance started to drop. I mean, there was a reliance really on kind of one mode of transport, so that was an issue, and if that person was unable to come, that affected the whole group. So that was a big piece of it. But I think there was a number of sessions in a row where there was kind of broader discussion and kind of support type discussions, but it also felt void of something, right? That wasn't enough somehow, right?
I'm wondering, like, you have support type discussions. I'm wondering, like, was there anything, like, a lot of groups, they also start with icebreakers every time, so, like, people get to know each other. So maybe, like, a neurodivergent equivalent of that, of, like, today let's everyone go around and start out by talking about your special interest and something that happened with that this week.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. I think that, again, is like a content piece. So I guess I could look into changing like the content, right, or the structure, but there was something more broad and I don't know what it is, but I like that, and I think it was too open, so there was really kind of this essence of, you know, there's no need to participate at all. You participate to the degree you want, right? And then I think what ended up happening was people came and said their stuff and we kind of said goodbye. It didn't feel important enough for the group to keep running.
Okay.
Right? So it, whether it just lacked substance, and it didn't seem to, because you know importance-based interest, right, which you were speaking to at the last session, there was something about it that, I don't know. Yeah, I was a bit lost. Yeah, sorry, Craig, go ahead.
No. I think all of those factors are very significant. And the other piece, which I guess is related to this, in terms of how do we outreach to neurodivergency, neurodivergent communities, because clearly this is an area that has grown in terms of awareness and interest, and yet there's so many people who still don't know enough about it. And we'd like to have people expand their understanding and have them come here or to participate in groups like your own. So I guess that's a third or fourth variable is what are the best ways to outreach, because it can be very difficult.
Like you want to provide space and opportunity to build community, but it's got to be right, and I guess I'm aware of biases around just neurotypical biases, right? Did I create a group that was essentially kind of too neurotypical in its essence, right? Too cookie cutter, right? And how can we think outside the box in terms of like what we're offering, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting because there isn't a cookie cutter for a neurodivergent group, so it's kind of like making up the rules based off of like all these concepts, but like not having the techniques for it formalized yet. And then the outreach part is also huge because like I can't think of like one place to reach out to get a large number of neurodivergent people.
It seems that younger people are much more likely to self-identify, and more, I would say adolescents and young adults seem to be more aware. And this is just a tangential note.
That's because of TikTok.
Social media. So all right. So you're speaking about social media. One of my clients is a mom, and she reported that her child came home from college with a hoodie that says, neurodivergent on the sweatshirt, and this caused a lot of distress among the parent and an encouragement. Do you have to wear that? Do you have to wear that around? And it seemed to elicit an anxiety response about how others would. As a mom, I imagine she wanted to be protective of her child, and also she was also aware of how this may have affected her as well.
And I think that points to like an interesting generational divide with like the younger generation. Like they're learning about the non-pathologizing take on TikTok generally, and then the parents still have all of these years of biases ingrained in them.
So you mentioned social media. Would more targeted approaches through social media be more likely to bring about people who might be interested in participating in groups?
Yeah, well, that's what made me think about a body doubling group or a parallel play group, however you want to frame it, was because there are these spaces online where you can go on to TikTok and you can search body doubling, and you've got like a quote-unquote room full of people like getting their shit done, right? And that's really useful, actually. for a lot of people who struggle with executive functioning.
Yeah, I mean, I do body doubling calls with people during the week, and they're great.
Right.
Should we explain what body doubling is? I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that.
Yeah, so body doubling is for people with executive functioning problems. It can be really helpful to have someone else doing something in the same room as you, or like right next to you. You don't need to be doing the same thing. So like one person could be cleaning their bathroom, and another person could be filing their taxes. It's just having the presence of another person. And an extension of this thing, Beth Ann also mentioned parallel play that starts in childhood. So neurodivergent people and autistic people in particular, they tend to, when they're young children, instead of playing in groups, they tend to prefer to do like a solitary activity, and it will be parallel play if like they're building with their blocks and someone else is playing with their dolls right next to them, and that will feel like a good, a not overwhelming social interaction to them. And so it's kind of like, it's almost a form of it is a form of co-regulation that lowers the anxiety enough to do executive functioning.
Right, and it cuts through inertia, state
Yes.
of inertia.
Yes, we are over time. But yes, so that was a good discussion. So just in terms of things, if you would like information from our previous workshops, these are the slides for our 2 previous workshops, and there's also a link to the YouTube page that has the recordings of those, and we'll have the recording for this one. Our next workshop, Navigating Identity and Adulthood for Neuroqueer People, will be on May 3rd, here, also free. And at the same time, you can RSVP with Craig or watch the live stream at the link in the QR code. And yeah, thank you for coming. Yep. Oh, you want the QR code?
Yeah, I need the details as well, yeah. Thank you, Kay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's also a bunch of resources after that last slide too.